If you've ever tried using productivity advice from books, podcasts, or YouTube and thought, why does this work for everyone else, but not for me? This video is for you. Most productivity systems assume you control your workday. And if you're a clinician, you probably don't. I remember realizing this very early and very clearly during my first real job as a BCBA. I had just accepted a role overseeing two ABA clinics for a large nonprofit organization. On my first day, everyone was incredibly welcoming. They told me how happy they were that I was there and how much they needed my clinical leadership. And then within the first few hours, I learned something that made my stomach drop. There were 4 treatment plans that had already expired. The clinics were providing more than 100 hours of services every single week, and they weren't getting reimbursed for any of it because the prior authorizations hadn't even been submitted. So my very first task was to get those plans written and submitted as quickly as possible. There was just one little problem. I had never actually written an ABA treatment plan before. At the same time, I was the only BCBA responsible for all 26 clients. Staff needed supervision, parents needed support, behavior plans were incomplete or actually just invisible, and everyone was looking to me to figure out what to do next. So I did what most people do when they feel overwhelmed. I started looking for productivity advice, something that would make me more efficient and more effective with my time. I tried time blocking. I tried writing my to-do list at night so I could finally get the tasks out of my head and actually get some sleep. I tried the Eisenhower method. At one point, I was even waking up at 4 in the morning and running before work just to feel like I had some sense of control over my day. And to be fair, some of those strategies did help a little, but none of them solved the real problem because the biggest issue wasn't how I planned my day. The problem was that my day wasn't actually under my control. And once I understood what was actually happening in my workday, it completely changed how I approached productivity. But before we get there, it helps to understand what's actually happening inside a clinical workday that makes productivity advice fall apart. Most productivity advice is built around a very simple model. You decide what you're going to work on, you sit down, and you focus on that until it's finished. That's the model behind things like time blocking, deep work sessions, or choosing the most important task of the day. All of those systems assume something very specific. They assume that once you decide what to work on, you can actually stay with that task long enough to make meaningful progress. But clinical work rarely operates that way. You might sit down planning to write a treatment plan or finish a report. You open the document and you start to think through what you want to write. And then something happens. Someone needs help, you receive an urgent message, a client has an incident, a meeting runs too long. Suddenly, the thing that you planned to work on is no longer the most important thing happening in that moment. So the workday shifts, and then it shifts again, and then it shifts again. And over time, your day becomes driven less by what you planned to do and more by whatever feels most urgent in the moment. And when that happens, something very predictable starts to happen. Important work keeps getting pushed further and further down the list, not because it's unimportant, but because something else always needs your attention first. This pattern shows up in clinical work all the time, and it's one of the main reasons traditional time management advice falls apart. It's also what I call the reactivity trap. And if you keep watching, I'm going to show you the shift that finally made productivity strategies work for me as a clinician. Because the real problem clinicians are dealing with isn't time management. It's something most productivity advice never talks about. And this pattern doesn't just affect productivity, it has a huge impact on burnout. Because when your workday is constantly driven by whatever problems appear next, something subtle starts to happen. Your brain never actually finishes the work it started. You begin writing a treatment plan, you get pulled away, you start reviewing data, you get interrupted, you begin planning for the next session, and then something urgent comes up. All day long, you're switching tasks, but very few things actually reach the point of completion. From a behavioral perspective, completion matters more than most people realize. Finishing a task is what produces a sense of closure. It's what tells your brain that something is actually done. But when your day is constantly interrupted, that closure rarely happens. Instead, your brain carries dozens of unfinished tasks at that same time, and that creates a very specific kind of mental pressure. It's the feeling that even though you've been busy all day, something important is still hanging over you. So the urgent things get handled, the crises get resolved, but the work that actually requires focus, writing plans, analyzing data, thinking through treatment decisions, keeps getting pushed later. And eventually it follows you home. That's how many clinicians end up finishing notes after dinner, or working on treatment plans late at night, or thinking about work all weekend long. And if that pattern feels familiar to you, I actually put together a short self-assessment that helps you figure out why work might be following you home. It takes about 2 minutes to go through, and it looks at 2 patterns that show up for a lot of clinicians: overcommitting and something called cognitive spillover. Basically, when your brain never fully leaves work. You can download it using the link in the description and see which pattern is most likely driving that feeling of work creeping into your evenings. Because once you know which pattern is showing up for you, it becomes much easier to start changing it. Over time, working this way becomes exhausting. You're constantly responding, constantly switching, and constantly carrying unfinished work in the back of your mind. And that's one of the quiet drivers of burnout in clinical work. Not just the amount of work, but the constant sense that the work is never actually finished. So if traditional productivity advice doesn't work in reactive environments, the real question becomes, what actually does work for clinicians? The first shift is realizing that clinicians don't need better time management. They need systems that help them recover after interruptions. Because interruptions aren't the exception in clinical work, they're the environment that we live in. So the goal isn't protecting a perfectly uninterrupted block of time, because that's not reasonable. The goal is making it easy to return to important work after you've been pulled away from it. When that part of the system is missing, important work keeps restarting from the beginning. Every interruption resets your thinking. Every shift in priority makes the task harder to come back to. And eventually, the work that requires the most focus becomes the easiest work to delay. But when you build systems that make reentry easier, something important starts to change. Important work stops drifting into your evenings and weekends. You can move things forward in smaller pieces, even inside a constantly shifting day. And that shift, learning how to work with interruption instead of constantly fighting it, is one of the biggest differences between clinicians who constantly feel behind and clinicians who can sustain their work long-term without burning out. And in the next video, I want to talk about why clinical work so often creates that feeling of being busy all day, but still behind, because there's a structural reason many clinicians end the day feeling like the work was never actually finished. Once you see it, it changes how you think about productivity in your clinical work entirely.